my talk today is really about that subset of the John Oxley Library. You're going to find a lot of material in there that if your family's had a fairly long association, or certainly were around at that time in Queensland, there's a good likelihood you may find something in the collections relating to your family history search. Now, I start this talk with a photograph. This is a photograph of Jack Matthewson. He's the son of a famous photographer who was operating in Brisbane, late 19th, early 20th century, Thomas Matthewson. And we have a lot of Thomas Matthewson's photographs in the John Oxley Library. He did a lot of work around Queensland. There's a great panorama of Townsville from the 1880s. Anyway, his son went to the First World War, and I often use that photograph because I think it's a beautiful, very aesthetic photograph, portrait. And often if we have school groups coming through or different talks to the public, I ask the school children, what does that photograph evoke? So I like the photograph because of its aesthetic properties. But what I have found is that over time you build up more and more knowledge about an individual person whose papers you may have, or a photograph of that person. And over time I've found more and more about Jack Matthewson. So he survived the war. He was with the Flying Corps at the time. He was taking photographs over the battlefields of France, Belgium. He survived the war, but and so I talk about him in presentations I've given over the years. It's only more recently I've discovered that because of Trove, going through Trove and finding a series of articles about Jack Matthewson. So in the 1920s, 30s, he was operating as a missionary in China. And while he was over there, he had sort of disappeared, and there were a series of articles. And then it was presumed that he'd been killed by tribesmen on the border of Manchuria and China. And so eventually there's an article about his funeral service in St. John's Cathedral. And then he turns up alive. And then there are a series of articles, "Hello, Jack," and Jack Matthewson returns. So I thought, all right, now I know much more about this individual person just from a photograph, one photograph. And recently at the Royal Historical Society, I was talking about Jack Matthewson, and in the audience was a relative. And she said, well, she knew Jack and remembered him well, and said, and did you know that he was a prisoner in Manchuria for 10 years or something like this? Just astounding extra details. Actually, it wasn't 10, it was a number of years. And that there was a German captive with him, and that German captive had written an account of their captivity in German, not translated into English. So it's just an amazing example of how one single photograph, there are depths below depths, and you're going to find a lot of information that's going to be very valuable for you. And even if you just start somewhere, there's likelihood that connections will take you other places. So the John Oxley Library has these range of formats covering military-related, war-related collections. It might be personal papers, diaries, letters, those sorts of things. A great photographic collection. There are publications, the sorts of publications listed in Stephanie's fact sheets. Incidentally, we have a fact sheet that's almost ready to go online, and I'll show you the resources page where we already have a fact sheet about Indigenous soldiers from Queensland in the First World War. And we're about to put up a fact sheet of our manuscript-related collections. So I thought I knew what we had until this Q Anzac project came up and we had the time to really interrogate our catalogue, and often things are catalogued in strange ways and there's no reference to war, or it might have been Jack Thompson, he went to France, and there's no extra detail. Went to France in 1916, and I've been searching for war and different battles and so on. And then I realised, gosh, I better do search terms for France and break them down. So we've discovered much more. So that fact sheet will be a kind of a list of most of the manuscript collections that we have, and it will go onto the resources page, and you may find somebody or families of interest there. Just quickly, realia as well. So medals, we have some medal groups. And we're starting to make digital stories as well. There are older oral history recordings that we have, a couple. And I'll play for you at the end of this presentation a little digital story that some of you may have already seen, but one that we've made recently with a lady in Cardwell, whose mother was a nurse, nursing the first of the wounded from Gallipoli. I mentioned Trove. So Trove is just this wonderful, just so much information that we find there that's just revolutionised everything we do in terms of research, saves so much time. I was, for example, searching for material about the John Oxley Library and war collecting, and I found a whole series of articles in the late 30s about these collecting drives that the Oxley Memorial Library was having. So the John Oxley Library opens in 1934 to the public. It was set up out of a memorial fund. Part of that money went to the establishment of the little monument across the river to John Oxley, his landing in 1823. And the other was to set up a library of resources about Australian and Queensland history, because there was seen to be a dearth of material here at the time. The Historical Society had emerged in 1913. Fryer Library, which is named after a World War I soldier, is 1927. John Oxley Library is 1934. And Ross Johnson, the historian, talks about in his book Brisbane the First 30 Years, he has this very fascinated by this generational concept in history. So every 20 or 30 years you're looking back to the past, and the generations are looking back on and reassessing or thinking about that period of history. I think that in relation to the World War I collecting is a good sort of theory to bear in mind, because the Oxley opens to the public 1934, 20 years after the war starts, and then 20 years after the war ends, in the late 30s, you've got collections coming into the Oxley and concerted collecting drives. So that is a image of the first John Oxley Library register. And what's highlighted are things to do with World War I. So you find peppered throughout all of the pages of those first registers things to do with World War I, because they're seeing things in the newspapers. A committee of returned servicemen had been set up. Certain records, objects and so on were going to the museum, and other sort of documentary materials were coming to the John Oxley Library, and we still have those things today. So, for example, Colin Butler, the MacGillivray Magster from Quilpie, war maps. So that was Lieutenant Colin Butler. He'd served in the First World War. His brother was A.G. Butler, the famous medico with 9 Battalion, who writes the official medical history of World War I from the Australian perspective. I only found that connection because of a Heritage Leaders workshop we had here in April. We brought everyone together, and it's all the people sharing what they know, represented from Quilpie. Said, oh, and by the way, I know the family in Quilpie, and did you know he was A.G. Butler's brother? And I said, wow, I didn't know any of that, but I had read his the troop ship diaries from the Clan MacGillivray ship that went across to the First World War. So we have that still, that if anyone has a relative who was on the Clan MacGillivray, for example, it'd be worth having a look at that, just because it gives you a flavour of what the men on the ship were going through, and the amusements they had and those sorts of things. And you see other references to World War I collecting. So it was quite salutary for me to go through those early registers and see there's quite a lot of World War I material coming in the 30s. That's just another example of an article in the Courier Mail. Your war relics, give them to the Oxley. So, machine gun pistol for the Oxley Library. I couldn't find that machine gun pistol. We think it went to the museum, and I've got them trying to find that over there. The photographs relating to World War I, it's a very rich source of imagery. Stephanie mentioned the rescanning of the Queenslander pictorial supplements from the weekends during the wartime period. That's going to be it's already on Trove, but the quality of those images is not good. So the rescanning at very high resolution will mean that you'll be able to search across towns, names, a team of volunteers indexing the names. As Stephanie said, names written under soldiers, little photos were written, so that needs to be all, they couldn't OCR that, so you have to type them in. So a lot of work's gone into that. It'll mean, although we already have an index in the reading room and so on, and other indexes we've done, it will be good that you'll be able to just search for a name on our catalogue, and you'll be able to bring up that image. You'll be able to get a high resolution copy of it. And also there are photographs of the home front and the war front. For example, if you put in Gympie, you will pick up tableau photographs of patriotic activities or Anzac Day or different things. So that'll be a very good source of information too. But the way the Oxley had kept its photographs over the years has been to categorise them, and there is a category for World War One, quite a few boxes of photographs, which are broken down by subdivisions of place. Sometimes it's kind of a chronological as well. And in there you find Anzac Day parades, Army. There's also a category Army, and so you can go through those Army box of photographs, and you can see the breakdown by battalions and so on. Obviously, 9 battalions well represented in there, and then the other battalions were formed after the 1st Division, and 2nd Light Horse is a particular strength as well. Wonderful photographs like that of troop ships leaving from Pinkenba Wharf. Just amazing, you know, if you think... I'm very glad to give this presentation from the family history perspective, because what I've found is that it's that family and human perspective that's what has made it a very emotional job for me to have that privilege of reading letters and diaries that were meant for others' eyes, you know, diary of a soldier back to his sister or what have you, but it gives you that real insight into what people were experiencing. Patriotic activities, Caboolture. The end of the war, and I always ask the school students when I have them, imagine jubilation, imagine the relief after that tragic period in our history and the world's history. I mean, the amount of people who lost their lives in that conflict, from Australia, as we know, 61,000 people were killed. But you think of the statistics, 998,000 odd British soldiers, 2 million Germans. This was a time that, you know, societies and then families within the societies, they all experienced incredible trauma. So even all of these years later, and I'll talk about George Samuel Devaney, I received his papers 10 years ago from his relative, and he still felt the loss that was must have been experienced by the family. So that's Queen Street, big crowd there. The photographs tell a million words, as they say. The very first set of personal papers that I ever listed and described, as we say in archival terms, so go through the material and order it according to chronology and format, was the Roy Proctor papers. He was a soldier with 15 Battalion. And he goes off to the war, and he's sending postcards and letters back to his sister Ruby, who lived in Kelvin Grove. And, you know, there are those kinds of photographs from Egypt. And he says here, I'm enjoying myself. Everything is so strange. I saw the pyramids today. Dancing Dervish, Cairo. Letters. So that was the very, very first collection I listed and described 10 years ago. And I found it very, very emotional when you realise that he was killed in action, and you find the letter from the captain back to his family. And that's printed in the paper, and there's a paper clipping of that. And then you realise that the captain himself was killed not long after writing that letter, I found out. Contemporary photograph of the cemetery at the Somme, the Guards Cemetery, where Roy is buried. And that's his grave. His headstone says, "He sleeps in peace, thy will be done, Mother Brisbane." Now, this particular set of postcards and letters and a couple of studio portraits, for me, as I said, I learned more about the collections as the years go by, and I discovered in our correspondence with the donor, who was a Reverend Gwither from England, that Roy's sister Ruby, Reverend Gwither's Aunt Ruby, he said she would take these letters out every Anzac Day and every Remembrance Day, and he says, and I have no doubt she would weep over them, and thus their condition will be much deteriorated because of that. Now that struck me. And then his mother, apparently, because he was awarded the military medal, kept that military medal everywhere that she went. It was sewn into her bag, so she never would have it away from her. And when she died in 1946, it was buried with her. So you just see in that, and also a colleague has found a lot of official letters she's writing to and fro, trying to find exactly what happened and so on. So another collection where I learn more every day, but just the power emotionally of, and sort of the moral responsibility we have when we take these materials to make sure that they're safe and to look after them and then communicate them to the public. It's very, very strong. So in relation to your own personal connection to World War One, I put this image up because this is my great-grandfather here. Now, this photograph, which is in a collection called the Lewis Family Photographs of a lady named Mrs. Lewis, whose parents grew up in the Blackall district in central Queensland, where my mother's from. We were organising oral history recording equipment to be sent to her father, and she'd contacted us about this. In the process of doing that, her father had passed away. And so in Hervey Bay, she was going through his things, and she found a lot of photographs, old photographs, and she asked me in talking, we realised we had a Blackall connection, and then she said, would I like to have the photographs? And there's a lot of Blackall district and various few army-related things, and I said, well, I'll take them to the John Oxley Library. And then in the photograph, in the collection, there's this one photograph of my great-grandfather. Never ever seen a photograph of him as a young person. My mother was very moved by it. Had lots of photographs of him as an old fellow. And he survived the war and had got shot a few times, and had mum remembers, knowing, show us your wound, Grandad, and his thigh and this sort of thing. So that family passing down of the knowledge of the World War One generation, my mother knew him. I was still alive. I was born in the early 70s, and he was still alive for a few years. There's photographs of him holding me as a baby, but I didn't really know him very well. But you see through the generations there are these connections. So wonderful to see that photograph, and like I said, it may be that if you have this family connection to this part of Australia, there may be things like that inside manuscript collections. That's why at the moment we're trying to digitise everything we can relating to World War One, so that you can, in the searches you're doing, come across these things and make those connections.
Simon, are all the names on that photograph?
No, it just has written on the back that the Blackall Boys, and that's a photograph when they'd come back, and it's vastly reduced numbers to what had gone off. But no, I know some of the individuals. What we are going to do is put that photograph on our blog, which I'll talk about, our World War One blog, and ask for further information. Can you identify these individuals? We mentioned with Stephanie before the clippings files. They're still a really valuable source of information because they bring everything together by a place or by a biographical surname. And there he is there. It's him there in the late 60s at a reunion of the diggers in Blackall. And there's a number of those men who were in that photograph that you saw before. So those clippings files are very, very good source of information. You can request those at the desk in the John Oxley Library reading room, and there's a form you fill out for newspaper clippings, and you can put your surname, biog, and they'll find that file for that name. If they're more prominent people, it's the full name of the person. So bear those in mind as a very valuable source of information. So the other sorts of things we have are these rare materials from the First World War. We have, for example, this is a photograph of Anzac Cove, and it's signed at what we believe is a reunion of 9 battalion, 15 battalion soldiers, perhaps in the 1920s. And you see all the signatures and enlistment numbers of the soldiers who were in those battalions. It simply had on the back of it, donated by Mrs. Bishop of Melbourne, 1938. With the old Oxley Memorial crest and sticker. And I went back to those registers that I talked about earlier on, and I did find the detail about it, but it just said the same thing, Mrs. Bishop of Melbourne, 1938. So we had Bill Gamage, the historian, and he was telling us a lot about the photograph and what he thought it was, and that probably a reunion in the 1920s, and he could see by the enlistment numbers who would have been at Gallipoli and who would have been not at Gallipoli, but later in other battles on the Western Front. And we learned a little bit, but we still don't know exactly what was the event that particular object was made for. But it's one of those things that we have that will be in our exhibition next year. Next year we're going to have, between April and November, an exhibition of the John Oxley Library World War I collections on the SLQ gallery, up in the Philip Bacon gallery, a treasures wall. I'm really devoted at the moment to bringing out the World War I related materials that we have. Casualty lists, 9 Battalion, that are sort of in a matte frame. These were done up on at Anzac Cove at the time, so obviously very, very important for 9 Battalion people and their descendants. So we talked about personal papers, photographs. Organisational records are also very important. The Anzac Day Commemoration Committee, this is really the committee that's formed out of the recruiting committee. As you know, as the war's progressing, at the midpoint, the immense casualties, so halfway through 1916, the Somme offensive, Haig's Somme offensive, 60,000 casualties in the first day. It's starting to get to the point where people are not quite as patriotic and enthusiastic as they were in 1914. In 1914, the war's declared 4th of August. By the 24th of September, the ships are leaving with 9 Battalion, 2nd Light Horse as part of that flotilla that goes around Australia. So we've got the photographs of the Omra, and you'll see the digital story with Nurse Keys on the Omra. Not much time. They recruited them and listed them. They had some basic training. They do a lot more in Egypt, but very, very quick. But by 1916, there's a lagging of enthusiasm. The numbers are not quite as high, so there are recruitment committees and there's recruiting drives. We know the anti-German propaganda was very strong. And then there was, of course, the plebiscites around conscription in 1916 and 1917, which were both voted no. So we only ever had volunteers going to the First World War. But things like the Anzac Commemoration Committee. So Anzac, Gallipoli really had been a failure. But how do you commemorate and how do you honour the soldiers who had given their lives in that the strategy of Churchill's of taking the Dardanelles and invading Turkey? It hadn't worked and they had to withdraw. But it was a big shock, and it was something that we had to think about how to honour those people who had given their lives. So the Anzac Day Commemoration Committee has a very strong Queensland sort of part. Queensland plays a very important part in that because Canon David Garland, the chair of the Anzac Commemoration Committee, Queensland branch, is very strong advocate for the types of ideas he has in what will be the order of the ceremony, so the dawn service, and there are various ideas floated around, but certainly the dawn service, the solemnity aspect, he wanted it to be like an All Souls Day for the dead and so on. He, as an Anglican chaplain in World War I, was a very strong voice in that. So there are these minutes of the committee, there are names of people there, all the different people participating in those meetings. Very valuable records which we're currently digitising at the moment. Now, we talked about George Samuel Devaney. I've been saying Deviney all these years, but I think I've been wrong, and it is Devaney. This is, like Proctor, for me, a very important group of records that has, in my life here, it's been very powerful for me to play a part in organising these, having them digitised, reading through these. So he's a farmer from Helidon, as we know from the records that you saw before. In that collection, which is sort of fits into a box, large box, there are letters, all the different letterheads of the YMCA or Presbyterian Church or Church of England, all those different organisations supplying writing paper. He is writing letters back home. His diaries and letters right from the beginning. So at Fraser's Hill Camp, he's doing training there. He records all sorts of interesting things. He's saying, for example, writing back home to his sisters, he says, "Dear kids," all the way through. And he's saying, today I was walking down Queen Street and this little girl said to her mother, "There goes a soldier of the king." No, so she goes, there goes a soldier, Mummy. And he said, I thought to myself for the first time, I'm a soldier of the king. It dawns on him what he's about to be doing. Little insights like that, and then the anti-German feeling that he had, ironically in a way, because Helidon would have had a lot of German families in that area. And incidentally, the whole question of the German people in Queensland is something we'll bring out in the exhibition. Obviously very large proportionally German population compared to some of the other states. I think the largest in Australia, actually, even more than South Australia, and very big part of the community. But the tide turns against them very quickly after the invasion of Belgium and all of that reports, that Bryce report and other things. And you see in Trove and the letters to the Courier Mail, the editors, how it must have been an awful thing to be a German person, particularly if you've been here for generations. You were really vilified at that time. And George is like any other person. He speaks quite harshly about Germans. He says, for example, they were calling for recruits to go to the Pacific areas, but I want to go and fight the Germans on the Western Front. I want to avenge those who lost their lives in the Lusitania. And, his diaries are full of the Hun and Fritz and all that. This little diary here is a beautiful little thing, a little French diary, very simple. It was in his pocket when he was killed in action. And we have letters from a Tommy soldier, an English soldier from Lancashire, writing back to the Devaney family, telling them about, well, I actually discovered George's body and I think he died of shrapnel wounds. He says, don't tell anyone, I shouldn't be giving you these details. But you do see that they must have out of that had some sort of sense of closure, to know there's a postcard with an X marking the spot. This is there's Dernancourt Station, this is where his body was found. That story in itself, and we've got the original letters and wrapping paper from Lancashire with a seal thing on it, really remarkable. We've still got all of this material. You get that full picture. You've got all of the diaries, you've got notebooks and little Wattle Day ribbon inside the diaries, and postcards, even his school books from before the war. It's construct a pretty good picture of his life. But you do see there's this photograph of all the sisters on the Hellerden, the steps at the house at Hellerden, and big tribe of sisters and one brother. And you just imagine the impact when they found that he'd been killed in action, because he's a very likeable guy. I'm sure that I would have got on well with him. He's just the way his jocular turn of phrase. He's also writing to tenants they have two houses in Milton, same side of what became the Milton Tennis Centre. Alsace and Lorraine were the name of the two houses. But they're very friendly with the guys who live there, the two people who live there. And you get a very good sense of him through those letters. Now, as I said, the lady, Faye Devine Collins from Toowoomba, who brought this material in, she was the nephew, or is the nephew of George. I'm still in touch with her because I did want her to participate in a little documentary we're doing about this collection. The thing I'm finding now, though, is that 10 years later, a lot of the people who are that sort of first generation after, they're now too old, because she says, I'm very old now, and my husband and I are sort of living from day to day, and I wouldn't want to organising, filming, and then I won't be available. So I had to sort of accept that, and but I've been in regular contact with her, and even this moved me the other day. I saw the funeral clipping from the local Hellerden paper. The Presbyterian Church had the funeral service for him, and the Reverend of the Presbyterian Church reads from the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, chapter 28, in which King David's son has died, and he says, my son cannot come to me, but I will go to my son. That's George. It's that Wattle Day ribbon from 1917. Very fragile. You see, this stuff is sort of... we need to work very closely with the conservators just to make sure that this stuff is put in, say, mylar slips to keep it together. We had to scan this material, so we had to be very careful with that small diary, for example. Just in relation to digitisation, another really great collection is the Del Pratt collection. He was a teacher at the Southport School and a former student there, and he served in the First World War, and we have he was taken prisoner by the Turks quite early on. So we have all of his letters and material. It's all been completely digitised. So you can go to our website and type in Del Pratt, Maurice Del Pratt, and you can click on the finding aid and you can look through all of the letters, diaries that have been completely scanned. And what I find fascinating is that between all of these records, the names of individuals cross-connect. So you'll see in the little film I'll play at the end, the nurse Connie Keys befriended this young man from who'd been to the Southport School, so he would have known the teacher, Morris Del Pratt. Also, we have a typed transcript of a diary, the original of which is in the Mitchell Library, of a submariner on the AE2, and the AE2 they were captured and they went to a prisoner of war camp, and the submariner says, "Oh, today I met up with Morris Del Pratt." So sort of all of these names, these individuals are cross-connected. The more you know the records, the more you build up a deeper and deeper picture of the cross-connections. We do things like a night in the John Oxley Library. This was from last year. This girl, Kate Walton, she's doing a PhD on prisoners of war taken by the Turks, Australians, and she'd done a lot of research on Morris Del Pratt. Lieutenant General Mark Evans, who was the chair of the Anzac Commemoration Committee, he's just recently stood down, and retired Naval Captain Andrew Craig is head of that committee now. And I'll talk a bit about that project before I end as well, that we've got the funding for. There is going to be a night in the John Oxley Library relating to World War I on the 21st of October. So they're in the evening, starting at around 6 o'clock, and they're advertised now, What's On magazine, you see also online. That's on the medical side of World War I. I said before, Queensland played a very important role. We have the Marx family papers here. Now, 3 brothers, they're all doctors in World War I, a prominent family in Queensland. Their father had been a doctor as well. S.B. Dodds, their half-brother, he'd been in the Boer War and then, in the First World War. And the 2 people who are going to be talking are Dr. John Pern, Professor John Pern, of course, very well-known doctor and historian, and Robert... Got a blank, but an author who has written a lot about World War I doctors and nurses, and he's done a whole series of books. One is called Gallipoli Doctors. Robert Leichman, Dr. Robert Leichman, also a military doctor. So do come along to that. That's going to be fascinating. The Marx family papers are incredible. Alec Marx, medical officer at Gallipoli, the letters back to Brisbane just tell you the whole story within what he can say. But they come back to Brisbane, typed out by Nesta, his sister-in-law, sent off to all the other families. So really good picture of what's happening. Gallipoli ones, what I've seen, but they're also Western Front, and just amazing little details. One of the Western Front letters talks about how with the lines moving, so the Germans come in and they're repulsed back and so on. At one stage, these villagers in this French village bury all of their things with markers, like trees, and they might be real treasures that they have, but they can't carry them with them. They get back, unfortunately, the whole thing's blown to bits and there's no marker you can see, and they lost it. They couldn't find where they put these things. Just little insights like that. But certainly Alec Marx's letters from Gallipoli, the first one talks about, A.G. Butler. I've just arrived. Butler's been acquitting himself very well. Everyone's singing his praises. Talks about how, the bullets flying around, even in your dugout. He said, one almost hit me. It bounced off my pipe lighter case in my pocket. He said, you can't guard against them. So very interesting insights. So that's a wonderful collection relating to World War I. That'll be that Marx family pays in that fact sheet that I'm talking about original collections. The World War I blog is a very valuable way we can tell stories about our collections. It's on the website. You've got blogs, and you'll see a series of blogs we have. The sort of army green coloured strip is for the World War I. And you'll just find story. There's one on Proctor, on Devaney, different aspects of our collections. Also, we're asking people to, if you have a family story about World War I, a relative who served, we can post those stories through the blog, and it's sort of a way of publishing the stories. Because right now I think there's this overwhelming sense that people want to share their family's participation in that period. So do have a look at that blog. Now, the QANZAC 100 is this project for which the State Library has received funding worth $7.4 million from the state government, who also gave money to the museum to do their Anzac Gallery, which the tank, the famous tank, will be at the centre of that. And also there's a refurbishment of Anzac Square as well. With our Q Anzac 100, we want to do a few different things. We want to, for example, record stories. So we want to create, and the one you'll see at the end of the presentation is an example, we want to create little, what we call digital stories, but little documentaries with people talking about some aspect of their family connection to World War One. So the one you'll see is Margaret Thorsborn from Cardwell in North Queensland. She's talking about her mother, and her father was with the 7th Battalion, a Victorian soldier. He was at the landing at Gallipoli also. So from all sorts of perspectives, that's a really wonderful thing to have because, I'll tell you why later. I'll tell you now actually. She was just this most remarkable lady. I talked to her on the phone. They were going to do a Who Do You Think You Are special on her, and for one reason or another, they had to pull out of doing it for editorial reasons. And Diana Pepper, who we'd helped with Kerry O'Brien, Who Do You Think You Are, that Stephanie was in, she said to me, you should follow this up. It's just a remarkable person, remarkable story she's got to tell. So when I was speaking to her on the phone, she just sounded so interesting. I said, we've got to record this story. So we flew to Cardwell. We got Sarah Scragg up north to record an interview with her, and you'll see the results after this. The important thing is, I mean, she lives in one of those parts of the world that cyclones are coming through pretty regularly, and Cyclone Yasi had completely destroyed the cottage that she'd lived in for years and years and years, since the 60s, I think. But she had this habit of keeping all of her important things in the oven. So she's got an Order of Australia, that's in the oven still, these other things. And so thankfully, although her cottage, she was safe in a safe place, but her cottage was sort of reduced to splinterwood. And the place where we did the recording was a different place that they had built for her. But it just goes to show that this effort now of recording stories with people who are really quite elderly now and are not going to be around forever, and the stories they have to tell, in this case I think it's a really remarkable story, but every family was in some way affected, I think, by World War One. So we want to use the blog to tell those stories where we can, if it's like a summary account of a person, with photographs and so on. But we also want to record within the budget that we have as many as we can. The other thing is to do digitisation of materials. So we want to identify about 100 collections around Queensland, and we want to digitise those and tell the story of those collections. We have this notion of a timeline of Queensland during World War One, and those stories can fit into that. And I think it's just a good opportunity to liberate the stories and collections from people's houses and little local historical societies and so on. We have a lot of school groups coming through, and that will continue through the commemorative period. Coming in, and they come into the white gloves room upstairs, and we can get out the original materials and do a white gloves experience for them. Next year, the good thing will be there will be the exhibition from April to November, so they'll be able to tour through those exhibition spaces. It's an interactive timeline. We talked about the Queenslander newspaper being digitised. That's a very, very important venture, that one, because I just think so much pictorial information there that's going to be really valuable for people researching places and people in Queensland. We have things like the First World War personal stories, personal experiences database that we purchased. If you have your eServices card, you can connect to the database. It's very interesting. You can look at letters and diaries that have been contributed from various institutions, Canada, England, different places. And you can also go in and look at objects. You can rotate like trench art things in 360 degrees. Just a digital collection item that we have that's a nice thing. You can take a virtual tour of a trench, for example. And at the end of the commemorative period, we have this idea that we will do projections around Queensland, perhaps taking those images from the Queenslander, for example, and if it was people from Blackall, projecting them on the local town square, or what have you. So I suppose the effort, and Andrew Craig talked about this, is about liberating these stories, but also in a sense people coming to life again, so that now this new generation, not just the school children, younger people, but us now 100 years later, can think about what people went through 100 years ago, the great, I suppose, immense trauma that society suffered through and families suffered through. But now's our opportunity, and I'm sort of really sad that I'm going now, that after all these years, just as it's getting started. We launched Charles Page's book, Memories in Place, which is a nice book down in the bookshop. He'd gone around photographing places in France, Turkey, Australia, just where there are traces of World War I in the landscape or streetscape. For example, I've moved to Carina Heights in Birdwood Road, of course, after General Birdwood. I've got an Anzac Park just across the road. It's Gallipoli Road is the next, so it's likely that, I suppose it was just it was a conflict that we needed to memorialise because of those immense losses. So the place is saturated with references to World War I. That's Andrew Craig there, actually. He's the sort of acting head of the Anzac Commemorative Committee that's responsible in Queensland for the different activities that will be going on about World War I. Now, I want to play that digital story for you.
When you're young, you're more interested in yourself when you're young. And I suppose when I was really young, I didn't realise what they'd both been through. I knew it, of course, but they didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about it very much. I admire them both greatly and wish I'd done other things too, done more for them, yes, yeah. Well, my mother was born in Mount Perry. She trained at the Brisbane General Hospital, and when war was declared, she volunteered almost at once to join the nurses going abroad. My mother and father did not meet till after the war, but they both went abroad with the same convoy. My father on the Hororata with the 7th Battalion, and my mother, one of the 4 nurses, on the Omra. The Queenslanders with the 9th Battalion. They all met up at Albany, and this big convoy set off, escorted by the Sydney and a Japanese cruiser as well, protecting the convoy. Word came that the Emden, that famous ship, was nearby at Cocos Islands, and the Sydney set off immediately to take on the Emden. And they engaged in that battle there. The Emden was outclassed by the Sydney, and the Emden was very badly damaged. Von Mueller, the captain of the Emden, ran it onto the Coral to stop it being taken by the Sydney. Some of the survivors, 40 of them, were brought onto the Omra. From a diary, she said, 8 of them came every day to hospital, have their wounds dressed. Doctor removed a big piece of shell that was deeply embedded in an arm. They were on the Omra for about a fortnight. German prisoners left this morning to the Hampshire. Sorry to see them go. Jacob Giebel, one of them, presented me with his cap band. The gift of the cap band could have been one of the first gifts of friendship between Australians and Germans in that war. Well, my mother, she went to Cairo. The troops were training in the desert, and the nurses and the medical men were getting the hospitals ready. But they naturally had spare time, and so the nurses saw a lot of the men. And that one young boy, Colin Reid, The day before he left for the Dardanelles, came to see her and gave my mother his mother's address so that if anything happened to him, she could write to his mother. They had some good idea that they mightn't come back. He was killed. My mother was really very upset about him, and she wrote in her diary, "Poor little laddie, I loved him so." He was only 19, she said about him. Because my mother had a lot of friends. There was no romance, anything like that. It was just, they were just friends. That's on the 25th of April. My father's in the boat. I think what is very sad about it is there are several men you can see slumped over the side. They've already been hit and they look as if they've been killed. And they haven't even reached the shore. This is from a letter to my mother's family about the Gallipoli landing. I don't know if the news is known in Queensland yet, but the greater part of the men we came over with are either wounded or killed. The whole battalion was practically cut to pieces. We did not get any of the wounded till Thursday, April 29th. This afternoon, 2 trains arrived with our first wounded, and it's a happening that will be in our memories as long as we do. To see these men walking and wounded coming in an endless silent procession, just too awful. No sound except that of walking. The wards began to fill, so many beds in all, many of the 9th men. Just too awful meeting them in the hall, on the stairs, everywhere. 11 p.m, to bed but not to sleep. Cried my eyes out. Here more trains today, fewer walking, many more carried in. The work almost appalling, seems hopeless. Men wonderfully brave and hopeful, but their eyes, the expression of them, just like dumb animals, makes me cry just to look at them. These young men who'd never hurt a soul in their lives, going ashore with fixed bayonets to land and invade. And the sad thing is too, when the wounded did come back from Gallipoli, a lot of them told my mother that they liked the Turks. They always fought fair, and they didn't know why they were fighting them. My father survived Gallipoli, and then he went to Cape Helles with the 7th Battalion. I don't think this gets as much publicity as other actions do, because there weren't so many Australians involved in that. And there weren't many left after the action at Cape Helles and when they were trying to take Krithia. It haunted my father for the rest of his life. He saw service right through the whole war. Well, my mother from Egypt, she went to England for a while, and then she was in France, being in 1917 and 18. She was in casualty clearing stations closest to the front line, on the Western Front towards Belgium. Wherever she went, she made it as attractive as she could, her little room or tent or whatever she was in. And she had a little office there, and she decorated it with pictures taken out of magazines. And outside she had a little garden. The boys would bring in ferns and other plants, and she heard them singing a song about the prettiest little office on the Western Front. And then there was a song that was popular in those days, My Little Grey Home in the West. And they were singing about my little grey home on the Western Front. And Mum didn't realise, of course, they were singing about her little office, and the prettiest little office on the Western Front.
My little grey home of the West.
And she stayed for another year after the end of the wars. And they met, I think it was south of Brisbane, this convalescent place. And they married, I think, early 1920s. And the first photo I have of them is of late 1923 with their first child. The thing about them was they never complained. They were never bitter about some things, but very sad about some of the things that should never have happened.